Hi, I'm Azul. I help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs, executives, and everyday next-door millionaires live their lives to the fullest. And today we're going to talk about how fear can rob us of living our life to the fullest and what we can do to keep fear in check and to make sure it doesn't get in the way of us becoming our best person and pursuing our biggest goals. So think about the cost of fear. Right? We all have dreams, we have ambitions, we have goals, we have things we want to do in our lives. So why do most of us not pursue our biggest dreams and not pursue many of our dreams if we do? And I think one of the big reasons is just fear. Fear that things might not go well. And fear can be a good thing, right? You want to be cautious, you want to take into account things that can go wrong, but it can also keep you from doing things that, you know what, you probably had a very high likelihood of having it enhance your life if you had pursued that dream, if you had gone after that. So I want to talk about a technique that was made famous by Tim Ferriss. He uses the term fear setting, and he uses that term like you and I would talk about goal setting, right? We're going to set our goals and we're going to explore our goals. That's something we're all familiar with. But Tim looks at it and says, let's really explore fears and from a logical standpoint, talk about what could go wrong and what we could do to minimize those things that could go wrong. And once we've done that from a logical and a rational standpoint, then we can make an educated decision. Is this too big of a risk? Is it not worth taking? Or is the upside of potentially succeeding here, does that dwarf what potentially could go wrong? And with the things that go wrong, are there things that I could do to minimize the potential impact and negative consequences in my life? So it's a really powerful technique. And while Tim Ferriss gets credit for this concept of fear setting, Tim is also very generous in giving credit to the Greek Stoics. They came up with this concept 1,000 years ago, and they called it premeditatio malorum, which basically means the premeditation of adversity, or as Tim says, the premeditation of evils. In building on this, the Greek philosopher Seneca is credited for a quote where he says, "We suffer much more in our imagination than we do in reality." And I think that's a really powerful concept for all of us to keep in mind, right? We have these dreams, we've worked hard. If you're a follower of my channel, you've likely had a lot of successes in your life, and you've probably done a good job of minimizing risk, which is an important thing. But we might have over-minimized on risk, and there might have been some risk that we could have taken that would have resulted in a much richer life. And as we get older and we have fewer weeks of active, healthy weeks, years in front of us, we want to make sure that we're not unnecessarily giving up on dreams because of some risk. So we're going to talk about this concept of fear setting and what we can do to minimize the likelihood of not pursuing our most important dreams. So fear setting basically has 3 main steps. The first one is you define what you want to do. Like in my case, I wanted to work remotely, okay? You define what you want to do and what things could go wrong, right? In my case, I could have coworkers that get jealous. I could have a boss that feels, I'm not getting my job done. I could have professional relationships that say I don't feel as close to you now as I did in the past, right? So these are risks that could happen if I started to work remotely. So that's phase 1, and really be brutally honest and maybe amplify what could go wrong. Come up with a list, maybe 6 of them or a dozen of them. What could go wrong? And then what could you do to prevent these things from going wrong? And then if it did go wrong, what could you do to repair it? So I started working remotely kind of at the tail end of the pandemic. So when people would ask me where I'm at, I would just say, well, I'm on the other end of your Zoom screen. And I kind of initiated what I call the don't ask, don't tell policy, right? What's the difference if I'm working remotely from the basement of my house 10 miles away, or if I'm working from Medellin, Colombia, right? Either way, both myself and a colleague that might be working 10 miles away, we're basically on the other end of a Zoom screen. So I defined what could go wrong, and I said, what could I do to minimize the risk of this going wrong, to prevent it? So, and the final thing is, what can you do to repair if the risk that you're worried about does come to pass? In my case, working remotely, if there was an important meeting that happened in the office, it would be better for me to be at that meeting in person, right? That was one of the risks that I had listed. And in fact, that actually happened. I was working remotely for Mexico City. There was an important meeting that took place in my office, and my boss called me and said, "Hey, we'd really like you to be at this meeting in person." what's the soonest you can be back in the office? And so I just bit the bullet. I told him I could be back in the office in 48 hours. I bought a walk-up airfare to get back to the United States so I could attend that meeting in person. And I changed things around. It turned out that it was better for me to be back in the office in person for several weeks. So in my case, I just made myself available. Okay, so at the end of step 1 and step 2, we've explored the risk. We've really gone in depth and talked about, what really could go wrong and what we could do to prevent it. And in step 2, we talk about what would be some of the mild benefits of even a small success if we do choose to do this activity. And so we're amplifying the risk and we're downplaying the upside to really give us a chance to take a critical look at these fears and to make a good decision. Okay, and now the final step is really thinking through what's the cost of not doing this, of not pursuing your dreams, right? I think as humans, we're really good and we're wired to really explore the risk, but we don't think enough about the cost of inaction. What happens if you don't do it? What happens if you don't try working remotely? What happens if you don't try to take a mini return? What happens if you don't ask your boss to relocate to a different office? Right? What is the cost of that in terms of relationship? And so in a previous video, I talked about mini retirements, right? What's the cost of maybe every 3 or 4 years not taking 30 days or 45 days to explore things that you want to do when you retire? Well, the cost of that is you might not be well prepared for when retirement comes. You might lose focus, you might forget about what those passions are, and most importantly, you might actually regret not spending that time. As we get older, we have fewer and fewer weeks that we can pursue these dreams, particularly ones that require physical activity and energy and excitement. And sadly, we're all just one stroke or one heart attack or one cancer diagnosis away from our entire life changing. So what's the cost of not taking full advantage of the time that you do have, even when you're working, by striving to take these mini retirements, by, if you want to work remotely, by looking into that, but how do you make the path more enjoyable and how do you prepare yourself so that you have a good idea of who you are and you don't forget who you are? So really look through the downside. What would your life look like in 6 months or 12 months or in 3 years if you don't pursue these things, if you don't try working remotely, if you don't pursue getting a mini retirement, if you don't ask out that special girl that you've had your eye on, right? How could your life look different? And I think that oftentimes will give us the courage to take these risks, right? Because oftentimes the upside on a scale of 1 to 10, the upside is like an 8 or a 9. And the downside, if something does go wrong, it's a 2 or a 3, right? In my case, working remotely, when I had to fly back for an important meeting to the United States, what was the cost of that? It was like $700 or $800. Did I like spending $700 or $800? No, I didn't. But that's a small price to pay in order to achieve the 8 or 10 that I've gotten by being able to work remotely. Okay, so that's the exercise of fear setting. I hope you find the idea of this exercise as powerful as I have found it to be in my life. I think if we invest a little bit of time doing exercises like this, we can get big benefits in our lives. I think our lives could look dramatically different and we could have more pleasures in our life and more enjoyment and more passions in our life if we take time to explore the things that are holding us back from pursuing our dreams.